What's going on, guys? Sean here, Sunday night, Hammerhead Garage. Nice to have yous on here. Just enjoying a nice beverage as usual. I don't know what you guys are doing tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about basic fuel injection. What I know of fuel injection. It applies not only to automobiles and hot rods, but it applies to almost everything made today. Snowmobiles, motorcycles, shit, even some ride-on lawnmowers and stuff are using it now. I'm not going to give you all the ins and outs, but just some of the basic information. I even wrote myself out a little cheat sheet here that covers some of the basic stuff that I want to talk about. There are pros and cons to both methods. You guys that are been on my channel for a while know I'm kind of an old school guy. I like the older stuff, but I have worked on newer stuff right up to 2018, and that's all modern fuel injection. And there's pros and cons to both methods, both ways. One of the pros is, for me anyway, especially up here in Canada, is ease of starting in the colder weather. The injected stuff seems to start a lot better just because it's modern and it's fuel injection. It starts easier anyway. Even on motorcycles, they start better. You do get a little better mileage typically, not always. Typically, though, you do get better mileage. The efficiency of the engine goes up, obviously, because instead of a carburetor injecting or having the fuel come in, and be distributed through the intake manifold, you have a set of injectors in that manifold that are spraying it in there, controlled by the computer. So basically how fuel injection works, you have a set of inputs, and then based from that, the computer determines what's going on with the engine, and then it delivers what's called a set of outputs. So your inputs are your sensors. Now, I don't know if you guys know much about sensors, but they're on just about everything nowadays. I mean, they're rampant. I'll go over some of the basic ones and try and explain to you guys that don't know maybe what they do, like a basis of what they do. Okay, there's different sensors for the inputs. The main ones are called the primary sensors. Things like the crankshaft position sensor, the throttle position sensor, the intake manifold pressure sensor, also called a barrel sensor on motorcycles, and the cam position sensor. The crankshaft sensor is basically there, and it works in conjunction with the cam sensor, if your model has a cam sensor on it, to tell the computer where on the stroke the engine happens to be. So it can tell based on data from the sensor. It's basically a Hall effect sensor down there, and every time the reluctor wheel passes by, there'll be like a separation or a magnet that'll send a trigger signal to be sent to the computer, and it takes reference from the crank sensor and from the cam sensor. It tells the computer, okay, this thing is at 270 degrees, bottom dead center, like just, it tells it where it is in the firing cycle. And from there, basically, it sends that information to the computer, and the computer takes all the other sensor inputs and then just makes a decision and sends the corresponding outputs to change things in the engine. The primary sensors are super important. That's a very high common failure rate on automobiles and motorcycles tends to be the crank sensor. They go out quite frequently. And I think a lot of that is a combination of the bean counters, again, that the quality is not very good, and the fact that it lives in a torturous environment. It's living in hot oil most of the time, or it's down there in the bottom. It's subjected to the heating and cooling. And as I said before, electronics are super sensitive to heat and cold cycles, so they tend to fail. If you get a car, truck, or a bike, for instance, that comes in and all it does is you turn the key and basically you wind the sucker over, and it's going and it won't start. A lot of times it's the crank sensor that's the cause. Not always. Cam sensors, typically they'll let you start the engine, but as soon as you shut it off when it's hot and you go to restart it, it won't restart. That seems to be a common thing. The great thing about these computerized fuel injection systems, though, is the fact that they have the ability to store codes in the computer. So the mechanic can go in there, he can put a scan tool on the OBD2 port. That's what they call modern fuel injection. There was OBD1 was the pre-96 stuff, and everything from 96 and later was OBD2. But anyway, they have the ability to get in there and see what code it is. Now, a lot of people think that the code tells you exactly what the problem is, but that's not the case. All the code does is it basically points you in the direction of where the fault may be. It might say something like O2 flow high or cylinder bank 2 or something like that. So it'll give you some idea. It's up to the mechanic to do the individual testing on the components with the meter or further test what the codes are telling you. And that's sometimes no easy task, believe it or not. You would think it would be simple, and so far there's no machine where you can plug it into your car or truck and it'll say green is good and red is bad, and like it just doesn't exist, right? So you still have to know how to troubleshoot stuff. So those are your primary sensors, okay? And that's what we call typically, like I said, stuff that comes in that'll rotate but it won't start. That's where you would start looking. Other than the obvious things, you want to check always fuel, spark, compression, right? Then you have what's called correction inputs. These are things that are engine coolant temp sensors, intake air temperature sensor, barometric pressure sensor, the baro sensor, vehicle speed sensor, and gear position sensor. Those are correction inputs. And the engine coolant temp sensor, its primary job is to send a signal to the computer to tell the engine how hot or cold the coolant is. And from that information, the engine will either richen the mixture, i.e. when it's cold, or it will lean the mixture out when it gets warmer. So it basically tells the computer what temperature the engine is. And from there, it'll adjust the fuel map up or down in the computer, and it does that through the pulse width, it's called, and it's in milliseconds of the injector pulse. So it'll either shorten the pulse or it'll lengthen the pulse of the injectors to allow more fuel in or less fuel in, based on that and a whole bunch of other inputs. The intake air temperature sensor, same deal, basically measures the temperature of the air. It tells the computer what the ambient temperature is coming into the engine. So the computer can also use that information to adjust timing, adjust the fueling or the ignition, depending on the ideal parameters that are built into those maps. The computer knows what optimum timing, what optimum fueling and ignition inputs to put in to make the engine run at its very best based on all these inputs. The barometric pressure sensor, well, again, it's not the ambient air temperature, it's the pressure of the air, usually in kilopascals or whatever, but it's just a pressure sensor. And it uses that input as well to get more of a read as to what the engine's breathing. Vehicle speed sensor, well, that's pretty self-explanatory. How fast the thing's going. The gear position, what gear it's in. Certain gears have certain maps that are used. Like a low gear obviously has a different map than what your cruise control gear would be. On a cruise situation, your fuel mixture would be leaned way out for optimum cruise, and that's all done through the inputs. And then the third type of input is called control input, and things like the bank angle, tip over sensor, and oxygen sensors. Now, oxygen sensors, basically, they're little sensors that are in the exhaust path. They measure the percentage of CO2 in the exhaust gases, so they give the computer a really good read on how lean or how rich the mixture is, how well the engine's burning it, and it can adjust things from there, basically, based on that. The bank angle and the tip over sensor, that's something you'd typically find on a motorcycle or an ATV. So if the thing basically, when over tits and was upside down, it would basically shut the fuel in the ignition off. So you wouldn't have, like, the fuel pump wouldn't be running and adding raw gasoline in a ruptured tank scenario where it would burn even more. So it's basically an interlock of sorts. It's a protection device. So anyway, so all those inputs have to go into the computer. The computer spins around, figures out what's going on with the engine. And this is all done in real time, quickly. And then it sends out outputs. And the things that are in the output category are things like the control outputs from the computer, like the injector pulse width, how long the injectors are running, what duration, what the duty cycle is. Duty cycle is like how much of a percentage of maximum the injector is at. Controls the ignition coils when the spark plug is fired. A lot of modern machinery has now what they call a stick coil, which is basically the coil is right connected to where the spark plug clips onto it. It's almost like a plug wire, but it has a coil built into it. And they're extremely sensitive to electrical interference and also voltage, millivolt sensitive, but they produce an enormously powerful spark. Stick coils will hurt you, man. Like, they will seriously hurt you. So you got to be careful working with those things. And they're super expensive. But motorcycles use them, cars use them. Even my old battle wagon out there, my old 2008 Sonata, it's got stick coils in it. But they are a good device, but you have to be very careful with them when you pull them out of the engine. They're very sensitive. If you whack them against the side of the motor, that could be enough to frig them up. So you got to be super careful with them. I normally lay a towel out on the intake manifold and just kind of lay them out in order, gently, not to disrupt anything. Then you got things like the fuel pump relay. That's controlled by the ECU. It tells when to come on, when to come off. There's usually a priming stroke when you turn the key before you hit the start position. You'll hear the pump come on. What it's basically doing is it's sending fuel pressure up to the rail to pressurize the rail, so that whenever the injectors are called to open, the high pressure fuel is right there to spray it out. Injection's different than carburetors. Carburetors, typically it's like 4 to 8 psi that the carburetor likes to see for fuel pressure. Fuel injection, normally it can be anywhere from 25 pounds right up to 80 pounds or 100 or even more when you're talking about direct injection, which is like the latest and greatest. It's several hundred psi. Right? And the direct injection is it has injector tip right inside the combustion chamber, almost squirting right directly on the piston. There's benefits and drawbacks for that as well. Other things that outputs for the computer would be the idle speed control. A lot of guys call it the IAC, idle air control valve. So basically it's the percentage of oxygen or the percentage of air that's allowed into your engine at idle in order to optimize the idle based on the input sensors, what they're telling the engine that it needs. A lot of that data gets passed down from the oxygen sensor. So if you've got a car that isn't idling really good, sometimes what it can be is you got your oxygen sensors are starting to get, they're getting old and they're starting to lose some of their signal strength, and they're very expensive a lot of times to replace them. So a lot of people don't do it. It's kind of a pain and a hassle, but either that, or if the car's got if it's got a built-in fuel filter, sometimes a lot of them filters don't get serviced very often, and they can start to gum up, and then your fuel pressure drops. And when your fuel pressure drops, your idle is going to be affected as well, right? You'll really notice it though when you're on the power, trying to make power, and it does the engine struggling, and you can't figure out why. Well, the first thing I would check would be the air filter, because that's up where I live. Mice sometimes get in the airbox and they chew great big friggin' holes in it, and they store nuts and stuff in there, so it blocks the air. I had my car actually trip a code one day, and I read the code, and I think it was like P0440, and it said oxygen in bank 1 is lean. And I figured out what it was. It was a mouse had he'd put a bunch of nuts or seeds or something up on top of the air filter, and it blocked the filter off enough that it tripped a code on the engine. So I mean, the stuff like they're very sensitive. These modern fuel injected things, right? So yeah, so things like that. It also, the outputs, they control the fuel delivery. So the fuel pump, the lines, the pressure regulator. They call it an FPR. It's a fuel pressure regulator. It's usually found right on the fuel rail. That can be an area, especially with Volkswagen and Audi and some of them other European jobs, where you'll have an engine that'll start and it'll run, but it doesn't run very well, very rough. And as soon as you go to give it gas, it dies. And that's a common issue with that is the fuel pressure regulator has gone out. So it's either supplying too much fuel to the engine or not enough. Generally, it'll fail where it doesn't give enough gas to the engine, but sometimes it'll fail the opposite way too, in which case you'll have severe black unburnt fuel coming out the pipe. But yeah, and I don't know, there's two ways of looking at it. I mean, the modern stuff does have its advantages. Like I was saying, you will have an engine, if it's running properly, you will have an engine that will get superior mileage, superior power, ease of startability, and a ton of other benefits. The downside is that if you have something like an ECU or a computer failure, typically they can cost more than the car is actually worth. You know, like it's not unheard of to pay 3,000 or 4,000 or even more for a computer. Some people call them PCMs too, powertrain control modules. There's a whole bunch of different names. It's basically the same box. So the failure rate's pretty high. Again, that's why I like carbureted stuff. I don't normally operate it in the wintertime, but I mean, when I was a kid, that's all we had. So, I mean, we had like choke flaps and we had heater boxes that went up directly into the intake of the carburetor that from the manifolds to provide heat into the carburetor passageway. And that they started. It's probably not as good at like 25 below as injected cars do. But I mean, if shit happens, I mean, my old bomb didn't want to go this week here. It was 25 below and it was really cranky. It was cranking awful slow, but it did catch. And my buddy Sean there, he had one there that was like his sister's car wouldn't start. But I mean, that was pretty much the battery, I think, on that one. The battery looked like it was from the prehistoric caveman days. He kind of laughed when I told him that, but yeah, so I mean, the injected stuff is super sensitive to voltage, right? So you got to have a really good battery in it and a good charging system, good alternator, good belts. And up here in Canada, I mean, we've learned to deal with how to winterize your car. Most folks in October, November, they'll start winterizing their stuff to get it ready for the winter cold, right? And one of the things we do is we test the battery, we put new belts on it. We change the coolant. You know, we make sure that we have a snow shovel and we have a set of booster cables, and a jump box is a good idea. It's a great idea. But anyway, like I said, the computer inside it, it's a bunch of electronic parts, especially the modern ones are very digital. They're very chip. They're like a board, like a computer board, like you would think. And they've got different things on them. Like I said, there's a fuel map, there's an ignition map, and there's a timing map. And how that is that every RPM from basically idle right up to the maximum RPM the engine could ever do, right up to like 50 or 25 RPM at a time, all the way up. There's different maps for each RPM level, for each sensor input, like a high load on the engine for like cold and warm temperatures. So the computer sees all those inputs from the primary and the correction and the control inputs from the different sensors, and then it'll adjust everything to make the engine run at its optimal based on what's happening at the present time with the engine. And that's why these sensors are needed, and that's why they're so important, because otherwise the computer's in the dark. And what happens then when these things fail, sometimes if the primary sensors fail, the engine will go into what's called limp mode. And some of you guys know what that is. So what limp mode is basically, there's two things. You have an open loop and you have a closed loop system. So limp mode will basically, it just takes a set of preset parameters that are already in the computer, and it'll base its engine timing and fueling and ignition on those presets. And that's designed to give you enough power, enough input to get your vehicle home or get it to the garage so you can get it repaired. But that's what the limp mode is. And some of these newer cars, you need a dealer scan tool in order to get it out of limp mode and everything else. And it's very hard for the average backyard guy now to work on modern fuel injection stuff unless he's got a lot of money and he's invested a ton of pile of cash and tools and stuff. Some of these scan tools are not even available to the public, these dealer level ones. Snap-on makes some, Blue Point makes some. There's a bunch of other companies that make them, but they're like $10,000 or $15,000 or more. I've heard of even more than that. And there's so many different models of car, truck and bike and everything else that you'd have to be a gazillionaire in order to afford all of them. So they're making it to the point where if anything at all goes wrong or anything at all is fishy, you pretty much have to go to the dealer to get the work done at an enormous labor rate. They're usually very high, the labor rate at a dealership. There's a huge markup on that. So that's another reason why I drive carbureted stuff and older stuff that I don't really care about. Like my old 08 Sonata, it runs like a top. It's got 331,000 kilometers on it. But now it has a busted windshield and it needs rockers because I live in the salt belt here. So in order to do those two things, I'd be looking at damn near $1,000. Well, it's really not worth putting $1,000 into an old shit box. You'll never get that money back. So basically I'll probably just drive it until whenever and then give up on it and go get something else. Try and find another good winter beater. Because, there comes a point where you just don't want to put any more money in them, right? And you can just throw a limited amount, like an unlimited amount of cash at these things. And winter beats, we call them up here in Canada, right? Just your old winter shit box that you're looking to get you through the winters. And the guys that have hot rods and stuff put them away. They don't want to drive them in the salt because the body would fall right off the damn thing, right? Anyway, that's the basics. And of course, in between the inputs, the computer, and the outputs is a million miles of wiring and connectors and clips and grounds and everything else in between under the sun. So now, when you take your car to a place where a dealership or whatever to have it worked on, one of the reasons, even any garage, why it's so expensive is because it takes a long time to troubleshoot some of this stuff. Like I said, there's no way you can just plug it in and just tell you exactly what the problem is. I mean, that happens sometimes, but it's very rare that happens. It's usually one or two other things. Or my personal record on bikes is 5 distinct separate issues at the same time they were happening. And I've even had bikes that were waiting to get fixed, that we were running in and out of the shop every day, suddenly develop a problem in that time frame, like a month. They developed an issue. We had one bike that developed 1 or 2 different issues, and they were serious enough that it wouldn't run. So, I mean, that's the problem too. How do you tell the customer? You're like, well, he'll say, well, the bike was running when I brought it to you. That doesn't mean anything. Failures happen at an alarming rate sometimes, right? It's nobody's fault, right? But anyway, that's just some of the things you deal with if you're going to drive. Like I said, it's 10 of one, it's 20 and a half dozen of another. It's just depending on what you want to do. I know some people that they buy a new car every couple of years, or they trade it in and get something new every couple of years, thinking that they're not going to have any mechanical problems with them. But as you can see from a lot of the channels that are on YouTube, and if you watch them closely, just because you have a new vehicle does not prevent you from having trouble. A lot of the troubles nowadays are the bean counters are getting in there and cheapening everything out. Ford's F-150s, oil consumption problems. Dodge has another problem with the transmissions. They're all having trouble. Hyundai, they can't keep an engine in an SUV. They're junk, right? And they're charging 40 grand for these things, right? They're no damn good. Mazda's having problems. Nissan's having problems with their CVT transmission. They're all having problems. Every single manufacturer. And it just seems to me that everything after 2009, basically in 2008, 9 was the cutoff year for the reliability, less chances of a problem, a little better quality. It seems to me that anything I made after that are having a ton of problems. You'd almost be better off if you're getting a new vehicle or just lease the thing and or get some sort of warranty where they'll cover everything. Like, I mean, everything that could possibly go wrong, including the tow to your dealership to fix the thing. But we're not all millionaires. Most of the guys I know up here, they just get old shit boxes for the winter, and they got their nice classic car that they drive in the summertime, or their motorcycle, and it's kind of what I do too. But anyway, if you're ever wondering how the fuel injection stuff based, not everything. There's a ton more to talk about in that regard. But that's the basics of how it all works. Some of these sensors, like for Volkswagen and stuff, are $400 or $500 or more. VW and Audi and Porsche, of course, and BMW and some of the other ones, they tend to be really, really highly sensored up rigs. A lot of their sensors are super expensive, and there's a lot more of them. It seems their systems, whatever type of fuel injection system and stuff they have, it tends to rely heavily on sensors, even more so than some of the more standard cars you'd find here in Canada. Anyway, that's pretty much my spiel. Please like, comment, subscribe. We're trying to grow this channel, like I was saying, and we appreciate you guys subscribing and jumping on board. And I promise you, once the snow leaves, we'll have some more interesting shit than just me on here yabbering on. But hopefully you guys are getting something out of this. You're learning something you didn't know. It's a process, guys. I mean, I learn something new every time I work on something. And I don't know it all by any stretch. I know a fair amount, but you're always picking knowledge up, all the way along. So like learning is it's a lifelong investment. It's a lifelong thing. You never stop, right? You thought when you get out of school that was going to be it. Well, it's not, right? You're going to learn until you're no longer here. The smart ones, the smart people, that's what they do. They learn as much as they can, right? Because knowledge is power. There's no question, right? But anyway, hopefully you got something out of that. I didn't bore you to tears. So we'll catch you next week. I don't know what the deal is with next week, but we'll take her one day at a time, and maybe I'll have a video in the middle of the week. Maybe I won't, but for sure I'll be back on Sunday. I try and do these around 9 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock on Sunday night, because I know a lot of times people have gotten their kids to bed, or they got their stuff sorted out for the evening, and they're able to come on and grab a beer or beverage or whatever and just kind of have a bullshit session with your buddy Sean. Anyway, boys and girls, take her easy. We'll talk to you real soon. Ciao.